Hello everyone, thank you for watching this video. What I would like to do in my talk is I would like to bring together the principle of plenitude with certain seemingly essentialist self-descriptions we hear from ordinary speakers. I think many people say things that highly suggest that they take themselves to essentially instantiate certain social properties, or that they essentially belong to certain social groups. When it comes to gender, Charlotte Witt has written, and I quote, "All the people I spoke with thought that they would not be the same person if they were a different gender. The world, it seems, is filled with gender essentialists," end of quote. And I don't think that gender is exceptional here. Maybe it is something people very often identify with in this seemingly essentialist way. But I think people also identify with other properties. We can imagine someone saying being a beatnik is not just a phase, it defines who I am. Or someone might say that their job is part of their identity. Imagine someone saying, I don't only work as a cook, I am a cook. Or take someone who says that becoming a parent really changed who they are. What do we do with these statements that are seemingly essentialist? I think this is an interesting task to give a philosophical account of the meaning of these seemingly essentialist statements. And I think there are three desiderata an account of these statements should meet. The first desideratum is that we should take these speakers seriously. It's simply not our job as philosophers to tell people that they do not mean what they say when they describe themselves in these ways. The second desideratum, I think, is that we should allow for change. So we find the datum that, for example, a cook says of themselves that they are essentially a cook. However, this person isn't born as a cook. They became a cook during their lifetimes. So how do we accommodate that people in some sense change their identity during their lives? And the third desideratum is that we should avoid involuntary fellow travelers. Maybe some people think that their gender is essential to them. Other people think that being a beatnik is essential to them. However, it might not be the case that everyone wishes to identify with their gender or with their membership in a certain cultural group in this particular way. So I think it is a desideratum to avoid that once we say that someone is essentially a beatnik, we have to acknowledge that everyone who is a beatnik happens to essentially be a beatnik. I think that in the current debate, most metaphysicians give up one. So they give up the first desideratum and they say things like, when people say these things, they don't really mean it, they use metaphors, or this is just loose talk. I think that this doesn't hold much plausibility because when people say these things, they are often in a very serious mood and they often take themselves to say something very meaningful about who they are. And I think we should, in some sense, pay justice to this seriousness that goes hand in hand with these statements. One notable exception is Charlotte Witt, who does believe that social individuals have their gender essentially. However, this leads to an exceptionalism when it comes to gender. Charlotte Witt believes that gender is a very special property, and it is, I think, the only property that is had essentially, or the only social property that is had essentially by these social individuals. She believes that at least in the society many of us live in, the roles played by social individuals are such that they are unified by a mega social role, and that the gender is this mega social role, and that for this reason gender is, how she likes to put it, uni-essential to social individuals. But I wonder whether we can also accommodate essentialisms for other properties, and whether we can accommodate essentialisms without having the result that everyone, or at least everyone living in the kind of society many of us live in, happen to have these properties essentially. Whether we can do so, that, so I will argue, depends on whether we accept the principle of plenitude. And what the principle of plenitude is, that will be the topic of the next section. So what is the principle of plenitude? Take a snowball. I think you do believe in snowballs. And snowballs, so one might think, are entities that are essentially made of snow and that are essentially roundish. Another kind of object are snow discords. The question is, should we acknowledge snow discords in our ontology? What are snow discords? Snow discords are objects that are also essentially made of snow, and they're essentially of a shape that is somewhere between being round and being disc-shaped. So one might think that once you acknowledge that there are snowballs, you also have to accept that there are snow discords. An argument to this conclusion is discussed by Daniel Corman in his book Objects. And the argument starts with the first premise that there is no ontologically significant difference between snow discords and snowballs. And the second premise is that if there is no such ontologically significant difference, then we get that if there are snowballs, then there are also snow discords. And the third premise is that there are snowballs. I think in the literature one can find basically three ways to react to this argument. One might try to come up with an ontologically significant difference between snowballs and snow discords. And that's exactly what Corman himself does. He believes that we can come up with a difference and that we can be elitists in the sense that there are snowballs because snowballs are in some sense elite, but there are no snow discords. And of course you have to come up with what accounts for eliteness, but the basic idea is we can come up with different descriptions. We can come up with descriptions for snowballs and we can come up with descriptions for snow discords, but only the descriptions for snowballs are apt to really pick out objects that we then have to acknowledge in our ontology. The second way to react is to eliminate snowballs. You might be so appalled by the prospect of having to acknowledge that there are snow discords in your ontology that you rather give up snowballs than to acknowledge snow discords. So you accept the first premise and you accept the second premise, and you get the result that if you believe in snowballs, then you also have to believe in snow discords. But you decide to give up the third premise. You decide to say, okay, then there are no snowballs. There are neither snowballs nor snow discords. If you generally apply this strategy, then obviously we end up with very few objects. And this makes you an eliminativist in the sense that you eliminate ordinary objects and all objects in the vicinity of ordinary objects. And there's a third way to react, which in the end leads to plenitude. And that's to be a permissivist, to basically embrace the argument and to say, yeah, okay, there are snowballs and there are snow discords. And there are also other things in their vicinity. There are also snow cubicles, with a snow cubicle being something that is essentially made of snow and essentially round, between being round and being shaped like a cube. So you have a very full ontology, and if you are someone with such a full ontology, then you might ask yourself, can I give a general principle that tells me which objects there are? And the principle of plenitude is supposed to be such a principle for permissivists. It is a live debate how this principle is to be spelled out. Here is just one very rough suggestion by Karen Bennett, and she writes, quote, "Every region of spacetime that contains an object at all contains a distinct object for every possible way of distributing essential and accidental over the non-sortilish properties actually instantiated there." End of quote. That, of course, is just one option, and it's a very, very short and not exactly very worked out way to put it. So then an account of what these non-sortilish properties are has to be given. Karen Bennett tries to do so, other people objected. I would like to set aside this discussion for now because the details of how to spell out the principle don't matter for the present purpose. However, if you happen to be interested in this debate, I think the full compass article written by Megan Fairchild is a very good place to start. For the remainder of this talk, I will just assume that the principle of plenitude holds, and I will have a look what the results we get are. So let us assume we accept the principle of plenitude, and now let's bring this together with the seemingly essential statements we discussed in the first section of the talk. So if the principle of plenitude happens to hold, then wherever there's a snowball, there's a plenitude of further objects. But obviously this doesn't only hold for snowballs, it also holds for pens and for pets, and it also holds, and this is the important bit, for persons. It holds for you and it holds for me. So given plenitude, where you are, there are collocated with you a plenitude of further objects, and for nearly every non-modal property you happen to instantiate. There is something that is collocated with you that instantiates this property essentially. And this has an interesting consequence when we are asking ourselves, which object does the first personal pronoun in a statement like, I would like to have a piece of chocolate, refer to? Who is actually speaking when we hear such a statement? And I think one guide in answering this question is provided by the principle of charity. And the principle of charity says that we should interpret speakers in a way that maximizes truth and that maximizes rationality. So if we have this in our background and now we hear someone saying, I am essentially a beatnik, how should we interpret this utterance? And obviously some candidates for the reference of I that happen to be located wherever the speaker is located are such that they are essentially beatniks. And the principle of charity suggests to interpret this statement in a way that it comes out true. And one way to do so is to interpret the referent, or to interpret the utterance of I such that it refers to an entity that happens to essentially be a beatnik. So the principle of charity suggests that if someone says I am essentially a beatnik, the person who is actually saying this is such that they are essentially a beatnik. You might object to this that the principle of plenitude is to be applied holistically. We cannot just take one utterance in isolation and then decide who is speaking, but we rather have to look across contexts. However, the gist of my proposal that it is a contextual matter who is speaking, and that collocated to the same human animal, there are very different objects with very different modal profiles, and it changes across contexts which of these objects actually is speaking, or which of these objects actually is the referent of the pronouns used. So why should one believe this? I think it is an independent datum that in different contexts, different self-conceptions happen to play a guiding role. And the idea standing in the background is that these are not different conceptions of the same object, but we rather have different objects with different modal profiles that in some sense surface in the utterances speakers make in different contexts. So how are these objects coordinated? Well, I mean, they are unified by being causally related. They are unified by being collocated. And they also share a number of beliefs, particular non-de-se beliefs. These are beliefs that are not about the speaker themselves, are such that they are shared across the board among all these collocated person candidates or objects. So this allows to sometimes not know who exactly is speaking, but to still get a very rough and basic idea of what is said. Why should one believe this? I mean, this is obviously a very non-standard proposal. However, it fares very well when it comes to accommodating the three desiderata we had at the beginning. So first of all, it takes speakers maximally serious because we do take them to be literally true when they say things like, I'm essentially a cook. Second of all, we can allow for change because we have the situation that in different contexts, different speakers, we have different speakers in different contexts, or the other, put differently, the first personal pronoun refers to different objects when we have different utterances of sentences that figure as self, or that are self-identifications. So we score very well on these two desiderata, but we also score well when it comes to the third desideratum, because there is no such thing as and exceptionalism when it comes to certain properties. Every property is alike, and for nearly every, at least for every non-modal property, there will be something that is collocated with me, and that is such that if I instantiate the property, then this thing instantiates the property essentially, which makes essentialism possible for nearly every non-modal property. Therefore, we don't have to say that if someone is essentially having a particular social property, then everyone who instantiates this property has it essentially, which helps us to avoid involuntary fellow travelers. I do not believe that in the end this proposal will work as it stands, but I think it's a very interesting starting point. It's an interesting starting point for thinking about the consequences the principle of plenitude has for the way we think about self-identification. And I'm very happy to have this chance to discuss this with you. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I very much thank you for watching this video. Bye.